He is 32 years old. He has a wife with dark eyes and a laugh he can still hear perfectly in his memory. He has a daughter who, the last time he saw her, had just learned to walk. He has hands that once held all of this: warmth, softness, life itself. Now those same hands are cracked and bleeding from digging frozen earth in -40-degree darkness. He cannot remember the last time anyone touched him with kindness. He cannot remember the last time a voice spoke to him without contempt. He has not seen a woman, not spoken to one, not stood near one, in 4 years, and he has at least 16 more to survive. This is not a story from ancient history. This is a Tuesday in Kolyma, 1947. The Soviet Gulag was the largest system of human imprisonment the modern world has ever produced. At its peak, it held more than 1.5 million people simultaneously: engineers, poets, generals, priests, farmers, teenagers, all reduced to a single category: enemy. And tonight, we are going to talk about one of the most human, most devastating, and most deliberately silenced dimensions of what those men endured: the complete and calculated erasure of women from their world. Because when you take away a man's freedom, you take his body captive. But when you take away every source of love, tenderness, and human intimacy, you take captive something far more difficult to survive losing. The Soviet Gulag system was architecturally and administratively designed to keep men and women apart, and nowhere was this more brutally enforced than in the remote northeastern camps of Kolyma. The geographic isolation of these camps, thousands of miles from Moscow, buried deep in Siberian wilderness, made the segregation almost total and inescapable. Unlike prison systems in other parts of the world, where some degree of social mixing occasionally occurred, the Gulag operated under a philosophy of complete compartmentalization. Men were assigned to heavy labor camps, primarily in mining, logging, and construction, while women were theoretically placed in separate facilities. This separation was not accidental or merely practical. It was ideological. The Soviet state believed that by eliminating gender interaction, it could more effectively break down individual identity and personal history. A man without a woman in his life ceases, over time, to remember himself as a husband, a father, a lover, a protector. He becomes only a prisoner, only a number, only a body that produces labor. The camps of Kolyma were particularly extreme because the sheer distance and climate made transfers, visits, and any form of outside contact virtually impossible for most inmates. Families were separated at the moment of arrest and remained separated sometimes for the entirety of a sentence, which could span 10, 15, or 25 years. Guards enforced the segregation violently, and any unauthorized contact between male and female prisoners in the rare mixed transport situations was met with severe punishment. The architecture of the barracks themselves reflected this: long, windowless, crowded sleeping halls that offered no privacy and no space for anything resembling normal human social life. Over time, this enforced segregation did not merely deprive men of romantic companionship. It severed them from the entire feminine dimension of human existence, from maternal comfort, from sisterly solidarity, from the civilizing and softening influence that mixed social environments naturally produce. Men became coarser, more brutal, more animalistic, not because they were naturally so, but because the system deliberately engineered conditions that made tenderness not just rare, but dangerous. To understand the psychological devastation caused by the absence of women in the Gulag, one must first understand what women represented to the average Soviet male prisoner of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. They were not merely romantic partners. They were wives who managed households, mothers who anchored family identity, sisters and daughters who gave a man's life meaning and direction beyond himself. When that entire dimension of human experience was suddenly and violently removed, not for weeks or months, but for years and decades, the psychological consequences were catastrophic in ways that went far beyond loneliness in any ordinary sense. Survivors of Kolyma consistently described a particular kind of inner death that occurred gradually over the first years of imprisonment. It was not depression in the clinical sense, though that certainly existed. It was something more fundamental, a slow erosion of the self. Because human identity, particularly for men of that era and culture, was deeply relational. You knew who you were partly because of the people who loved you and whom you loved. Strip away those relationships entirely and the self begins to dissolve. Many prisoners described forgetting the faces of their wives and mothers, which they experienced not as a neutral cognitive event, but as a kind of moral failure and grief so deep it had no bottom. The psychological literature on sensory deprivation shows that even short periods of isolation from normal human stimulation cause hallucinations, cognitive distortions, and emotional breakdown. The Gulag imposed a form of emotional and relational deprivation that lasted for years, and it did so while simultaneously subjecting prisoners to physical exhaustion, malnutrition, extreme cold, and constant threat of violence. The combination was uniquely destructive. Men who had been educated, sensitive, and emotionally complex before arrest often emerged, if they emerged at all, fundamentally changed. The capacity for tenderness, for vulnerability, for the kind of open emotional expression that intimate relationships require, was often permanently damaged. Varlam Shalamov, one of the most important witnesses to Kolyma, wrote that the camps produced a specific type of human being, one who had learned to suppress every emotion that could be used against him, which meant suppressing almost everything that made him human. The sexual reality of the all-male Gulag environment is among the most suppressed and least discussed aspects of Soviet camp history, and yet it was one of the most significant features of daily life for hundreds of thousands of prisoners over several decades. Homosexuality in the camps existed on a brutal spectrum that ranged from genuine emotional attachment between prisoners at one end to systematic violent sexual exploitation at the other, and understanding this spectrum is essential to understanding the full human cost of the Gulag system. Among the criminal prisoners, the so-called blatny or urki, who formed the dominant social class in most camps, sexual hierarchy was inseparable from the broader hierarchy of power and violence. The strong preyed upon the weak with complete impunity, and the camp authorities generally tolerated or ignored this reality because it served their purposes. A prisoner population that was internally divided, traumatized, and focused on surviving the violence of fellow inmates was less likely to organize resistance against the state. Sexual domination was therefore not merely a byproduct of the Gulag. It was, in a functional sense, a tool of administration. The lowest rung of the camp hierarchy was occupied by men who had been sexually subjugated, known by various degrading terms in camp slang. Once a man fell into this category, his status was essentially permanent, and his conditions of existence were among the worst imaginable. He could be traded, loaned, and abused by multiple prisoners without any recourse. Political prisoners, who typically arrived with no understanding of criminal camp culture, were particularly vulnerable during their first months of imprisonment. Those who survived long enough to learn the social codes often did so by finding protection through other means, useful skills, connections with guards, or alliances with more powerful prisoners. The existence of genuinely consensual same-sex relationships was also documented, particularly between political prisoners who formed deep bonds of emotional and physical intimacy in conditions where such connection was the only warmth available. These relationships were viewed very differently within the camp social world, depending on which social class the participants belonged to, and they were almost never spoken of openly, even in the memoirs written after release, reflecting both the enormous stigma of the era and the genuine danger of disclosure. While the dominant reality of the Gulag was strict gender segregation, there existed exceptions, situations and locations where male and female prisoners found themselves in proximity, and these encounters reveal an entirely different but equally disturbing dimension of life under the Soviet camp system. Mixed gender contact occurred in several contexts, during transport on trains and ships where men and women were sometimes held in adjacent or shared spaces, in certain camp complexes where male and female zones were not perfectly separated, in work assignments where both sexes labored in the same general area, and in camp hospitals and medical facilities where the desperate need for labor sometimes overrode the administrative rules of segregation. What happened in these spaces of proximity was rarely romantic in any simple sense. The power dynamics of the camp environment, where food, warmth, protection, and survival were distributed according to hierarchies of authority, made genuinely free and equal relationships almost impossible. Women in the Gulag faced a particularly cruel set of choices. They could resist all male attention and face the full brutality of camp conditions without any protection or supplementation of their rations, or they could enter into arrangements with male guards, administrators, or powerful criminal prisoners that offered survival benefits at enormous personal cost. The phenomenon of camp wives, women who attached themselves to powerful men within the camp system in exchange for food, protection, and marginally better conditions, was widespread and extensively documented. These arrangements existed on a continuum between calculated survival strategy and outright coercion, and the line between them was often impossible to draw clearly. Female prisoners who bore children as a result of these relationships faced an additional layer of tragedy. In some camps, children were taken and placed in special Gulag nurseries, and mothers were allowed only minimal contact. The existence of mixed camp encounters also generated its own brutal underground economy, where female sexuality became a form of currency in a world that had stripped away all other forms of value and exchange. Among the most extraordinary and humanly significant responses to the deprivation of the Gulag was the degree to which certain prisoners, particularly those with intellectual and artistic backgrounds, channeled their longing, their grief, and their suppressed emotional lives into creative and intellectual activity. This psychological mechanism, which Freudian theory calls sublimation, was not a conscious strategy for most of those who employed it. It was rather an instinctive reaching toward survival, a refusal to allow the self to be completely destroyed by redirecting the enormous energy of repressed emotion into something that could exist, endure, and mean something. Poetry was perhaps the most important of these outlets. The conditions of the Gulag made writing physically dangerous. Paper was scarce, private possession of written material was punishable, and anything that could be read as political was a potential death sentence. And yet prisoners wrote. They composed poems in their heads and memorized them with the discipline of people who knew that memory was the only library they would ever have. They recited to trusted fellow prisoners in whispers, passed lines from one person to another across the barracks in the darkness. The act of making something beautiful, of finding words, precise and resonant enough to capture the experience of loss, of longing, of remembered love, was an assertion of humanity in a system designed to deny it. Drawing and visual art served a similar function. Men drew portraits of their wives and children from memory, sometimes on whatever surface was available, margins of permitted books, the inside of matchboxes, the wood of the bunk itself. These images were acts of love and resistance simultaneously. They said, "I remember you. You still exist. I still exist." The intellectual life of political prisoners, many of whom were professors, writers, scientists, and artists, also expressed itself in informal education. Prisoners lectured each other on history, philosophy, mathematics, literature. In conditions of total material deprivation, the life of the mind became not a luxury, but a necessity, the only space the state could not entirely colonize and control. The final and perhaps most important keynote requires stepping back from individual experience to examine the systemic and ideological architecture that produced all the conditions described above. The sexual and relational deprivation of Gulag prisoners was not an accidental consequence of imprisonment. It was a deliberate instrument of a state philosophy that viewed certain categories of human beings as enemies, parasites, or raw material to be processed in the service of socialist construction. To understand this, one must understand the Soviet conception of the prisoner, which was fundamentally different from Western penal philosophy, even at its worst. The Gulag did not merely seek to punish. It sought to transform, or failing transformation, to extract maximum labor value before the prisoner's body gave out. The destruction of personal identity was central to both goals. A man who remembers himself as a husband, a father, a professional, a member of a community, retains a core of selfhood that makes him resistant to propaganda, to complete submission, to the redefinition of his worth in purely productive terms. Strip away his relationships, his intimacy, his sexual identity, his role within a family, and you strip away the psychological foundations of that resistance. The deliberate use of sexual deprivation as a dehumanizing tool fits within a broader pattern of identity destruction that included the replacement of names with numbers, the prohibition of personal possessions, the destruction of family correspondence, and the systematic humiliation of intellectual and professional identity. Guards were trained to address prisoners in degrading terms. The entire ceremonial apparatus of the camp was designed to communicate a single message: you are nothing. Your history is nothing. Your relationships are nothing. Only your labor has value, and only for as long as your body can produce it. Understanding this dimension of the Gulag is not merely of historical interest. It is a warning about what becomes possible when a state decides that certain human beings can be categorized out of the full protection of their humanity and begins to construct systems, legal, architectural, administrative, cultural, that operationalize that decision at massive scale.